Good day to you from Anagalactic on this Sunday, the 5th day of July in 2026. Today we're going to begin something that's a little bit off the beaten trail of science, although this is a form of rational logic where we are analyzing an ancient manuscript. I speak, of course, of the famous Revelation of St. John. I'm expanding the title page of R.H. Charles's translation and exegesis of this ancient book. The book is approximately 2,000 years old, but it's a bit less because 2,000 years ago, really 2,025 years ago, is the somewhat accurately dated birth of Yeshua, which is his Hebrew name, known in English as Jesus and in Islam as Isa. I call him Yeshua because he was a Hebrew descendant of the tribe of Yehuda and therefore would be called in modern parlance a Jew. The reason for stating all of this forthrightly is because the revelation of St. John is the revelation of Yeshua. That was given to an angel, according to the record of St. John, whoever that was. There was a man involved, of course. This is quite similar to the case of other prophets in general, but Muhammad in particular. Muhammad lived about 600 years after the birth of Yeshua, and he was given a very special prophecy, which is, of course, accepted by approximately 2 billion people today. It is by far the most important religion that has ever appeared on the face of the earth. Nobody questions that. It is about 1,300 years old and is called Islam. But that prophecy that was given to Muhammad, who would correspond to St. John here as the human intermediary or human recipient, the prophecy was actually delivered by an angelos, an angel, which in modern scientific language would be an extraterrestrial or an alien, some being not of this earth. So that is the source both of the Revelation and the Quran. The Quran was not written by Muhammad, nor did Muhammad speak it, although he recited what he was told, but it was spoken by the Archangelos Gabriel, who in the Hebrew tongue we transliterate into English as Gabriel, and that's how I will pronounce it, not in the Arabic fashion, but in the English fashion. Throughout this exegesis, or really commentary on this most important book, I will be pausing at the initial mention of anyone's name whose name is foreign to English and give you my preferred pronunciation, which will be a matter of convention I am forced to select in order to remain consistent and coherent. Excuse me, you may hear a hawk calling outside. It is the season of the hawks here in Northern California, and boy, oh boy, are they vociferous. I believe you can hear that through the open door. I cannot close the door because it will be near 100 degrees today, and therefore we're forced to listen to all the various noises, of which this town is full. In my last video presentation from July 4th, Independence Day here in America, we were treated to a helicopter, a low-flying helicopter, which regularly traverses the route between San Francisco and our own Enloe Hospital. Extraordinary sound, right out of Apocalypse Now, if I might just name drop. A low-flying helicopter, a train, which is only about 4 blocks away as the railroad line, and it issues about a 120 decibel horn about 30 to 40 times a day and all through the night. We got one of those. And then we were treated to a siren, a first responder paramedic siren, which is parked exactly 1/2 a block from where I live, right on the other side of the highway, which Fortunately, I'm far enough from the highway that I don't hear it. But then after that, we got the raucous squawk of a jay. And the jays will continue to just bark and bellow for upwards of an hour if they spot a cat, which is down in the creek usually, and they will just squawk and not stop. It's just unbelievable racket. But they also will gather around a hawk. They don't like hawks. And they'll go right up to the hawk and sit on the branch next to it and just screech at it. And they've even been known to swoop hawks. They're really quite brave creatures. And then we got to hear the hawk, which I believe is the best of all the noises heard here in this town. So that's our introduction to the Revelation, whose name really is unofficial, or you could say official, but it's conventional. The best title of the book is taken from the first line of the text, which is written by the author before he begins reciting what he was told. And he basically reported in the same way that Hanok did. Now, Hanok is one of those names that I have to explain. It's Enoch in English, but Hanok in Hebrew. And interestingly, in Arabic, it is Idris, I-D-R-I-S, Idris. So I thought you might be fascinated to know a little bit of background in this very strange book. It is considered by all and sundry, from the beginning of its appearance among men all the way to the present day, absolutely baffling, absolutely mysterious. One of the most unimaginable books to appear in the otherwise, I would say, coherent transcripts of the Old and New Testament, just characterizing them generally. They are readable, certainly. Now, not all of the books of the Old and New Testament are of the same, I'll just say, quality of obviousness. If you were to read some of the minor prophets, such as Obadiah, or Habakkuk, I don't believe there's anyone alive or dead who ever understood those books fully, and they're not very long. But this is a strange book among strange books. It is, without question, the strangest, most bizarre, really words fail. The book is just astonishing, and it's quite intense. Nobody who has ever read any part of the book of Revelation has failed to be impressed with its overpowering nature, which is really a form of literary, I would say, technique or genre or genius that nothing ever written in or out of science fiction, in or out of fantasy, in any way is comparable with this magnificent book. I have been studying it for 50 years. I have made an attempt on the average about once a decade. I am an amateur Bible scholar, although amateur, it's really hard to say where amateur or professional is divided, unless you use some conventional division, like do you have a degree, or are you associated with a seminary? But just in terms of labor, I'm certainly up there with serious scholars of this book. About once a decade, I have gone through the book with a fine-toothed comb. I have used every kind of translation, interlinear. Of course, I've read dozens of commentaries. I have devoted much of my life to the study of this book. And I will confess right at the outset that for the first 50 years, which is practically the whole time I've been studying this book, I've had glimpses into portions. Some portions are actually rather more easily understood. None of it is easily understood. And there are several frameworks for approaching the book which have highfalutin names, which I won't even go into. No, this is meant to address a general audience, not from any sectarian point of view, not even from the point of view of if you believe it's a canonical book or not, which is still doubted. Even though it was canonized, you would have to know what canonization actually entails, which is a huge, unbelievable story all in itself. How did this book get into the Bible? Did it have trouble getting into the Bible? There are two opinions, at least, on anything you can ask about this book. We're not even sure who wrote it. The man does identify himself as John, but there are at least 4 Johns, and you would have to say that there is a possibility that it's none of those 4 Johns that were named in the New Testament. At first, it was thought, although you'd have to ask who thought this, but at first it was thought that it was John the disciple, John the beloved, he's sometimes called one of the disciples. And then there's a whole story about, was that the John who wrote the Gospel of John? Because the Gospel of John nowhere says that it was written by John. Whereas the book of Revelation, it has been pointed out, says that it's written by a man named John, but it does not say the Revelation of John. Now here in this translation by R.H. Charles, you will see that it does say the Revelation of St. John. The reason he puts that as the title, and he's practically unique in doing so, is because that's what the first couple of lines in the book say. We're going to go through this, not exactly verse by verse, because that would take far too long. But we will be studying certainly the opening verses, and then something from every chapter so that you have some sense of the entirety of the book. And I will attempt to give a full outline of the book in this video, which is quite a challenge, but as long as you recognize that there's a trade-off going on here, I want to be concise, but whenever you're being concise about something as extraordinarily complex as this book, you're going to necessarily be leaving out a lot of extremely pertinent information. The alternative at the other end of the spectrum is to be fully exhaustive, and this particular book, which was published in 1920 in 2 volumes, is about 1,000 pages long. Charles is an extraordinarily highly respected Bible scholar who is acquainted, that is, he's an expert in the Greek of the New Testament, and so he has translated, on his own recognizance, this book, as many of the early, well, I'll just say earlier, exegetes or commentators on the books of the Bible were wont to do. If you knew Hebrew well enough, you were tempted to make your own translation. And that has gone on all the way into the modern era, where certain scholars will elect to translate for themselves. How do they do that? They have to get hold of the manuscripts and do exactly what was done in translating it into English. Actually, even to put it together in the original tongue, which may actually have changed over time, which manuscripts are written in which language. In this case, it was Greek. And the time of the book, although, of course, as with everything else about this book, it's uncertain, the earliest manuscripts, which is an entire story in itself, because there are different sized manuscripts, some of them just being fragments of the book, so that I would have to say in 2 parts what is the earliest manuscript. The earliest manuscript that covers a substantial part of the book, approximately from chapter 7 to chapter 21, which is most of the book, is dated from the 3rd century AD, 300 years after the birth and death of Yeshua, whose life covered a span of, we think, from 30 to 40 years, but nobody is certain of that either. Not much is known about Yeshua, and not much is known about anything that happened at the time of Yeshua's ministry. This is in stark contradistinction to the life and times of Muhammad. Muhammad is by far the most accredited and supported prophet of all time. He wasn't of the Israeli transmission, and he perfectly was aware of that, as all Islam scholars are aware to this day. He was a unique prophet. He was of the he was of the lineage of Ibrahim. He is a Shemitic person, and a Shemitic person is also hard to define. But the Yehudi, who are called today the Jews, were the last tribe of the Israelis, and the Israelis were all descendants, of course, from Abraham by a 2-generation gap, because Abraham did not have as a son the man who came to be known as Israel. His original name was Jacob, but he wasn't a son of Abraham. He was a grandson through Isaac. Yitzhak is his name in Hebrew, Isaac. And not really much is written or known about Isaac, except what you read in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. But really we know a lot more about Ibrahim, whom I will call Abraham, but Ibrahim is the Arabic name of Abraham, as we call him in English. Israel has a lot of information about him in Genesis. The Genesis is divided into 12 manuscripts, as I was able to demonstrate, based on the work of Wing Commander J.P. Wiseman, who wrote an amazing book, which you can get for free, having to do with excavations made in Babylonia, whereby he was able to make some really interesting discoveries about how the book of Genesis was put together, according to what he learned about how the most ancient writing on earth was put into clay tablet form in order to send really a message on a number of clay tablets. A certain form of prescription and postscription called a colophon was discovered in these tablets, which has a direct correspondence with a certain repeated feature in the book of Genesis, which thereby divides it into 12 separate manuscripts. You would have to say manuscripts, although they were almost certainly written on clay tablets. The earliest known form of writing was on clay tablets. So that's a lot of information just to get us going on this strangest, most difficult to understand book ever written in any language on earth. It is considered to be, according to its own words, which we will get into shortly, but not in this video. This will simply be an introduction to the reading, which I will begin in the next video. But in order to even know what is being read, I find it necessary and really congenial to give this preliminary video so you'll know something about what in the world is this book. I mean, it is in the Bible, we know that, but how did it get into the Bible? In fact, you would have to know how books were chosen by a process called canonization. Who was responsible for that? You would certainly have to know that to be able to accredit the Bible as such. Well, it's really quite an interesting subject. But all of this just makes the whole field of study way too complicated for a layman. It's just beyond the ken of people who don't devote their entire life, as I have, to studying such matters. It's extraordinarily complicated. It's not just complex. And I wish to make a comment on the difference between complexity and complication. Complexity implies structure, which can be vast, or it can be simple. And that's the level of complexity in some kind of structure, which can be so vast as to perhaps defy the concept of coherent structure. So complexity deals with structure, but complication deals with anomalies. Complications are segues, red herrings, stuff that just comes in which doesn't really have much to do with the topic, but must be considered. And examples can be given of complications and complexities, but that would take us a bit too much into the rigors of logic, on which I'm also an amateur researcher all my life. So I basically have as my credentials, although but on my own recognizance, I believe my own credentials based on my own work is basically geometry, which is the nature of this channel in general, geometry, but then really form and structure, of which geometry is, you could say, the logical form, really based in mathematics. That's what makes geometry different from morphology, which is the more general study of structure. And that, of course, is a vast topic with vast numbers of applications and contexts, wherein, for instance, biology, morphology simply refers to the form of the animal or creature. Instead of just studying form, such as the forms of galaxies, the shape, it's more than just the shape when you're talking about astrophysics, because of course you're talking about physics. So there, in that realm, not just limited to astrophysics, but giving an example of the more specific use of the word morphology, it concerns not just form, but the origin of form. In other words, how things develop. Such as a galaxy, how do spiral galaxies form? So that's the more general, or you could say even the more, was it a more particular use of the word morphology. So I consider myself a devoted student, preferring not to say expert because that's relative, but a very devoted student and researcher of geometry, morphology, which is closely related to geometry, and I'm also a scripture scholar, which does have a lot to do with form, because you're trying to put things together, and this is the general nature of science. So it's a rational inquiry into Holy Scriptures, considered to be holy in some way, which is another question. What makes a scripture holy? Isn't it just a human writing? Well, it is definitely that. But we're talking about its source, and really, finally, its intent. There's a meaning to communication, and a written communication can be called a transmission. It's a message. It's a book or a story or an essay. There are several forms of writing. The general class of writing under which the book of Revelation is classified can be stated in several ways depending on your framework. But a word you'll hear a lot, we're going to hear that hawk this whole time. I just want to pause. Of course, it's now going to pause too. But that hawk is just going to be an accompaniment. Think of it as the heavenly choir. The book of the Apocalypse, which is very often its Greek name, it is its name in the Greek text, apocalypsis, which means the pulling aside of the veil or the tearing aside of the veil. What veil, what pulling, what tearing? Well, there we go again. I will be explicating all this, but I'm just giving you an overview of the tremendous challenge, really the monumental difficulties in explaining, describing, interpreting, classifying, deciding anything about this book is just the epitome of a challenge to a rational logician. And that was one of my credentials I wanted to mention. I've studied logic all my life. Not consistently, because it's quite engaging. And I have a wide range of interests, as I think most men do. We all are forced or compelled, or we desire to concentrate our efforts in some area, because then you can get more intensive. But you can't get intensive about all the topics that you would like. You don't have time. It really helps to be a polymath and to have an extraordinary memory. I don't think I qualify in either of those categories, but we all have a little bit of everything. Everything's on a spectrum, really, with humans, human intellect, human perspicacity, how good are you at what you do? Well, in science, which really is in the broadest sense here, I'm speaking of just general human communication, that is mano a mano, just talking either to one person or everybody on earth, depending on your intended audience. You communicate with your voice, which is orally. You can record your voice, you can make videos, which is obviously what I'm doing, but you can also write books. And then how do you disseminate books? Well, all of this has a historical context. Perhaps you didn't have a printing press. Well, back in the days of John of Patmos, that's the name, the most commonly given name to the man who wrote this book is John of Patmos, to distinguish him from several other Johns. There was no printing press. So how did this book come to even be written? Well, we're not going to go into that because it's not pertinent to our topic, although it would have to be if you're absolutely serious about understanding this book. I will attempt to convey to you my understanding, which I believe, I don't want to sound pretentious, but I have devoted 50 years of consistent effort to this book. About once a decade, I've read the whole book with a fine-toothed comb, attempting to analyze the book in a way that I didn't the previous time or times. And the last time I did that was within the past decade, and I still was not quite getting it, but then in 2025, about a year and a half ago, in January of 2025, I had, within a few months of then, discovered for myself the Quran. And ever since then, for certainly 18 months, I have been a devoted student of the Quran and have expanded my research to cover all of Islam as far as I can go, and I have gone quite a long ways. And that gave me some extraordinarily new insight, I would have to say, on Scripture, that is, Holy Scriptures, revealed transmissions to men. It just changed my perspective in an extraordinary way. To the extent that I now consider myself to have always been Islam. And Islam is a very interesting religion. It's unique. And you could say all religions are unique, but there is a hierarchy of uniqueness. And Islam is absolutely precious to me now. I consider it in a way that I don't wish to fully express at this time, because I don't want to get into religion per se. That will be necessary as we study the book of John, but I'll make sure that this doesn't challenge you to make you think or suspect that I'm trying to convert you to some religion. I never try to do that. That is not possible, in my opinion. I did try it was part of my perceived commission, which was to give men the choice to accept the gospel or not. The gospel, of course, simply being the message of good news from heaven. However you interpret that, you would hope that it would be something consistent. Of course, men are quite, men are men, and we know there's a lot of complications in trying to decide anything about religion. So I don't approach the matter that way, but you should know my history is that of a devoted Christian. I am a Christian. But that is a loaded word. And I have given quite a few, I'll just say, critiques of what is called Christianity these days, and to a certain extent, what Christianity has always been. And I should put it this way, how Christianity has been perceived. Because the whole idea is communication, both in religion and in science, which I now consider to be one thing. And I'm not alone in having tried to unify religion and science. Al-Ghazali, the greatest of the Islam scholars and one of the most important men who has ever lived on this earth, is Al-Ghazali, who lived approximately in 1000 AD, just to give it a ballpark figure. He died in 1111, and that's in, I believe you would call that the 12th century. But he lived in a time called the Golden Age of Islam. Islam is extremely old. It's 1,300 years old, and it's a continuous religion, and it didn't splinter. Although there is a major division that has persisted to this day from early times, which you may have heard of if you know anything about Islam. There is Sunni, and Sunni simply means it pertains to the Sunnah, which is essentially the, I guess you could say, tradition, or somehow the substance of Islam would be. That's an interesting word to try to define, but the Sunnis are basically conservative, and they're 90% of all Islam people, and basically always have been. So they're by far the majority. It's not like the Catholics and Protestants, not at all. The Sunni are very much almost identical with the other major sect. The state religion of Iran, by the way, is Shia. And those people call themselves Shiites. The followers of Sunnah call themselves Sunni. So those are the two major groups. And they're almost identical, but they themselves don't think so. And that's, of course, a matter of taste. In other words, they normally get along. But, of course, since they do have somewhat different points of view on what I would call either basic or very important issues, it's not really divisive. It's more of a different take, because the religion of Islam is strictly based on one single text, the Quran. That's where everything is derived. However, every religion is forced, really by a matter of necessity. It's not random. Every religion forms a tradition, and the body of tradition is separate from the main text. For instance, the Christian tradition, however that be with Protestants or Catholics, would be the body of doctrine or dogma or just way of life pertaining to the text, which in this case would be what is called the Holy Bible, which is actually about 66 books, but then there's more to be said about that too. So a lot of this goes into great depth very quickly, making it extremely difficult for a layman to really get a rational approach path to such an enormous topic as, for instance, religion in general. Although it is possible to simplify the concept of religion so that it can be talked about at least, but everything is based on communication. In this case, it ends up being written communication, but neither in the case of Revelation nor in the case of the Quran did the author accredit the ideas to himself. In other words, these are not the writings of men. It's a transmission from heaven that is being transcribed. In the case of Revelation, it begins with the words of John. But in the case of the Quran, nothing is of Muhammad. Muhammad didn't contribute anything to the book called the Quran. It's entirely the exact transcript, according to Muhammad himself, upon whose word we're forced to rely. But that's the nature of all transmissions. You have to trust the source if you're going to trust the material. So was it actually a transmission from heaven to Muhammad? That's a matter of belief. You would have to, but you also have to make a rational decision. That's just obvious. So you do have to decide. You see this term called faith, this process or this thing called faith. How does it differ from rational logic? Should it differ from rational logic? Must it differ from rational logic? Quite a philosophical question, which again, I don't intend to go into these areas. I simply want you to know what's in the book of Revelation. and that will be the subject of the upcoming video series on which I am going to concentrate while still producing from time to time my continuing series on geometry, which we're now at the stage of synthesis, where I'm giving you all the secrets of the universe as promised, including the final definition of what is reality, what is consciousness, what is the universe, what is everything, the final answers from physics, using this new geometry called spherical geometry, which has a mathematical basis that is non-Euclidean, called two-componency. Quite profound, but that has quite little to do with religion, and I will not be dealing with religion except, of course, this is a religious book. It has a context, and it focuses on a very important prophet. And there I wish to leave off this video with a comment on the relationship between Muhammad and Yeshua, who weren't that far separated. They are the last two prophets that will ever be. Muhammad was extraordinarily unique, absolutely divinely unique. He's not an Israeli, but he is a Semite, which means essentially a descendant of Abraham, because Abraham was a Semite. And the definition of a Semite in the time of Abraham, where they did not use that word, they used the term a Hebrew, which means a descendant of Heber, who was a progenitor of Abraham. So he's in the lineage of Abraham going back in time. And so that's where we get the term Hebrew. But Heber was a Semite. So then the question remains, what is a Semite? It's a descendant of Shem, who is one of the sons of Noah. So a Semite is a descendant of one of the sons of Noah. And Noah had 3 sons who survived the flood: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's a most interesting story on which I've devoted quite a bit of energy, because my main topic of interest originally in my 20s and all the way to today was Genesis and basically the creation of the solar system, which is in Genesis 1 and 2, and the flood, which is in Genesis 8 and 9. And I've given quite a few video lectures on that topic in 2026, but going back to 2025, I wish to make one more interjection so you know where I'm coming from. A major discovery was made in Holy Scripture in general, just the Holy Scriptures of the earth, which, by the way, go well beyond that of the Quran and the Old and New Testament. There are Holy Scriptures in other cultures. There are the Vedas and the Gitas, which essentially come out of India, and there is an amazing writing from ancient China called the Yi Jing. The Yi Jing, which I'm sure you've heard of, that is a holy book, and I can prove that. There are other texts which are so diverse and so, I'll just say, difficult to analyze that I will not cover those. But there are these 2 volumes of Holy Scripture out of India called the Vedas and the Gitas, on which, although it's a huge subject, both of those are extraordinarily long texts. But within those texts, I found in each one direct evidence of monotheistic core, such that no matter how polytheistic became either Hinduism or certain aspects of Buddhism, or even some other religions which you could name, if you're a scholar in that area, it is quite an extraordinary topic, is to study the Indian religions, that is, the religions of India. You could spend a whole lifetime doing that, or just simply reading the Vedas, which encompass volumes. The Gitas are a little bit different, but in each one of those enormous volumes of text, I was able to find I'll just say a couple of paragraphs, extremely well known among those who study such things, where it could be from Israeli scripture. It's a paean to the one true God who has no equal and no partner. The very basis of Islam is there is one God with no equal and no partner. That's the only true definition of religion. But even though, at least according to my upbringing, the way I was exposed to Hinduism, and I'll just say anything from the Orient, that is India, Tibet, that area, that it was polytheistic and really beneath the dignity of any Western man to consider, I no longer take that view. And neither has Islam ever taken that view. Islam treats all religions on equal ground. They are rather firm about the monotheistic aspect, which every true religious person must be, and I am. So if you want to know where you and I might diverge in opinion right away, it's only going to be on that one issue. There is only one God who cannot be compared with any other being. Absolutely, you could use a fancy-dancy word, ineffable, which essentially means unnameable and undefinable. And that is the view taken by both esoteric and exoteric Islam, is that God cannot be named. He does have a name because we have to use some name for this supreme being. And the name chosen in Arabic is Allah. And that is a proper and holy name, although it is a human name. He also has a revealed name through the Hebrew prophets, that is the Tanakh, the Israeli transmission, which goes back all the way to the founding of the Israeli tribes at the time, essentially, of Abraham. But where did those texts come from? Where does prophecy originate? In 2025, I was able to discover for myself a book which I had heard of but had never studied, for the same reason I never studied the Hindu scriptures, is because it was presented to me in such a way through my society or culture or religious milieu, is that the book of Enoch was simply off limits. That it was a strange, inscrutable, apocalyptic book. But in 2025, I found myself having a desire and need to finally confront that book. That is, to read it. And that has changed my view of religion absolutely and completely. That book has confirmed everything that I ever learned about the Bible that was unacceptable to the Christian sects that I tried to serve. Namely, things about the name of God, which is the third commandment, the Sabbath of God, which is the fourth commandment, and various aspects having to do with Genesis 1 and 2, the creation of the heavens and the earth, as it is called, and the flood, on which I consider my research into the flood is probably, if I had to choose what to express to my fellow humans, Americans in particular, it would be the flood, because that's science. And that is an amazing story which transcends all religion and all science, because it unifies religion and science on an absolute basis. So now there is no difference between religion and science. And that goes to biology too. I'm able to make statements about the speciation of animals and plants and the speciation, so-called, of humans that change the entire model for both of those sciences, making me somewhat of a authority because I have the right answers. And these are the most vital questions that have ever been asked by man in science or in religion. I have those answers. And because of my studies now into Enoch, on which I am certainly one of the foremost authorities on earth on that book now, I have read everything that there is to know about that book, which was quite a research process, which essentially is concluded, although I continue to reread and study that book. It is the most ancient prophecy of all, and it can be proved that at least one version, and I say two, the Slavonic and the Ethiopic versions, which overlap, of the Book of Enoch are reputable. They're actually intact. And that's saying something, because that prophecy of Enoch, called Hanoch, and that's my preferred pronunciation, and that's the one I'll use, Hanoch. In Arabic, he is known as Idris, definitely known as a prophet there. That man lived before the flood, and he predicted the flood. And he shared that knowledge with Noah, who also had received a vision of God that there was going to be a flood. And both men were prophets. But Enoch was the first prophet to write. And the Islam people taught me that. And there is corroborative evidence that I have validated to the best of my ability as a logician. You can rely on the Book of Enoch the way I know it, the way I explain it. I know what it means. I know what it says. And it predicts Yeshua. It's the prediction of the elect one. The elect one. So Enoch predicted Yeshua. That is well known. Although that's a relative statement. Well known by whom? It's been esoteric until now. And so has the book of John. This is not unheard of, that some prophecies are dated to the future, that they're not written for their present generation. Daniel's last receipt of a transmission from heaven, Daniel's prophecy in the last chapters of the book by that name were not for him and were not for his generation, and the angel who spoke those words to him told him that. And Daniel was extremely frustrated by that, because Daniel was a Zionist. Daniel was a Zionist. And the angel told him, in answer to Daniel's question, what shall befall my people in the latter days? This question was also asked of Yeshua, who gave a similar dated answer, dated to the future. After Yeshua was crucified, resurrected, and ascended to heaven, he gave one last prophecy in the Israeli transmission, because he was Yehudan, and thereby closed that prophetic sequence. About a half a millennium later, Muhammad was given a prophecy by an angel. The reason I mention this is because of who that angel was. He is named in all three cases where he spoke to a man. And Yeshua said, and you can look this up in the New Testament, those of you who are willing to do such a thing, that Yeshua made a most interesting statement, that it's necessary, if you want to follow Yeshua and know his doctrine, his teachings, his revelation, the gospel, then you must study that prophecy of Daniel, the last prophecy of Daniel in the book by that name, which it comprises several prophecies over a period of time. But the angel that gave that prophecy to Daniel is named Gabriel. Gabriel in the Hebrew. Gabriel in the Arabic. And you might want to know, is that the same angel that spoke to Muhammad? Yes. So Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. Gabriel also spoke to Daniel. And Gabriel was the angel that accompanied Hanoch. So Gabriel is at the beginning and end of all revealed prophecy. When I say revealed, I'm talking about the transmission. This is where the Chinese and Indian and other religious religions are different from the Shemitic transmission, really the Hanokian transmission, which began before the flood. That's specific. Was it given to all men? That's a point of tremendous divisiveness, and unnecessarily so, because the revelation of heaven to earth is to all men and does not require any prophets. The actual saving message of Allah, which is a proper name of what I would in the past say the Lord. I don't like to say God for reasons which may be obvious or may not, but when referring to the supreme deity, I do prefer now just to say Allah, because that's the most accepted name consensually among men. These are the Islam people, of course, but 2 billion people say the name Allah for the Most High. El Elyon is the name I use, really, I suppose, in my own mind. But he does have a revealed name, and that is Yahweh, which is often pronounced Jehovah. That's a mistake. And by modern linguists, it's also pronounced Yahweh. That's also a mistake. I know how to pronounce it, and I know its meaning, and I'm the only man who does. So there's enough pretension, but those are my credentials. I am able to explain the book of Revelation to you, and that's what I'm going to do. And this is for a general audience. Whenever I speak, as I'm doing now, to communicate with the general public, as I have done in 2 countries, on the gospel, I am always constantly speaking to children. Children are welcome to hear what I say. But I wish to give you a warning. What I say is not meant for all adults, because children are innocent and they can understand what I say, and if they don't, that doesn't hurt them. But there are men, full-grown men, who simply are incapable of understanding anything having to do with truth. And I am not talking to you, because you're hopeless. And you know who said that? Muhammad. Once an atheist, always an atheist. You're anathema. If you don't believe in God and don't say so, that's okay, because then it's just between you and God. But as soon as you open your trap and you start talking about deity as if you had the right to say anything, you had better not use the word atheist or show any disrespect to the Most High. If you do that, you're out. And that's not on my authority, but if you do what you do as an atheist in my hearing, you're going to feel it. If you have questions as a legitimate seeker, which we all are, feel free to ask questions. But if you want to rebuke me,
because you're from some God-cursed religious sect like the Mormons,
you leave me out of your shitty little game with Satan. I don't care what you are. You are not going to contradict anything I say, or I will have your neck, intellectually and emotionally. It's too late for patty cake. All right. So I had to get that off my chest. I'm not a pundit. I'm not an imam. I'm not a teacher. We only have one teacher. You know who said that? The great teacher said that. And he did not say it was himself. So if you say that Jesus is God, there's only one God, not 3, not 2, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. May we all have our eyes open to the truth available to every child. And let me remind you of the words of the Master. If you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, which is the whole idea, you will enter it as a little child. I suggest you think about that. Thank you very much. We'll be right back. Don't worry. I will tell you what the book of Revelation means so that you will understand it. Stay tuned.